All right, welcome everyone to another episode from Stephen and Simon here with them, a business coach of In the Driver's Seat. Both Stephen and I are, let me start over again. Um, all right, yeah, welcome everyone to another episode of In the Driver's Seat, the podcast that is all about bringing the conversation of how to build a valuable and ultimately sellable business to the business owners as early as possible. Both Stephen and I are certified value builders, certified exit planning advisors. We work with a lot of business owners in that realm of how do I build it? How do I build a valuable company that ultimately I can then sell or run or pass on to the next generation?
Hmm.
And uh, we started this podcast. I always want to go back to our inspiration for this because of the reality for a lot of business owners, which
Yeah.
is there's the dream of building a company and then selling it, and then there's the reality that often that's unfortunately not true. So, Stephen, thanks for being with us again
Yeah.
today as well. And do you want to maybe launch us into the reality for small business owners when it comes to successful exits?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the reason why we exist and the mission we have is to reverse these stats here, and it's 3 out of 4 businesses that go to market do not sell. Um, that coupled with the stat of 70 to 90% of a business owner's wealth is tied up in their business. So essentially, what that's saying is, business owners, you are putting up to 90% of your overall liquidity, your overall wealth at risk, by saying, by not running your business in a way that is built to sell, that is valuable, that is de risked. And we want to make sure that business owners have these ideas in mind and are building their business to be sold.
Yeah. And again, like it's a very how do I say that? I just had another conversation this week with a group of business owners, and we were talking again about like the time investment and everything that comes along with building a business and the sacrifices that owners make.
Mhm.
And and again, the major feedback was people weren't aware of
Mhm.
how much the stats are actually stacked against them because
Yeah.
you never really think about exit until you're like really close to it, or most people don't. And yeah, so hence our podcast here. So
Yeah.
today's topic, well, we talked about in past episodes, we talked about how business valuations work, and there is so on one side of the equation we or of the multiplication we have the an expression of profit, and then we have a multiple to it, and that is um, a little intangible. It's not so accessible to it. I mean, there's some rules of
Mhm.
thumb, like based on size or your profit itself can kind of like place what the multiple is, but it's
Yeah.
also driven by a lot of other things, right?
Mhm.
And so we call those like the intangibles. And
Mhm.
last week we talked about, or one ways to look at it is the four capitals: structural
Yeah.
capital, human capital, social capital, and cultural capital.
Mhm. Yeah.
And last week we focused in on the structural capital, and today we want to talk about the human capital.
Human capital. Yep.
Human capital. So, and to be honest, this is like a lens that is like it was a little harder for me to grasp than maybe some other ways to look at it. Um, so when it comes to human capital, what are we actually talking about here?
Mhm. So human capital, how I really look at it is, looking internally to the people, um, that are involved with your business, the ones that are actually operating the systems, the structural side that we spoke about before. Uh, One way to maybe summarize how we look at this, or one way to look at it, is what's your internal net promoter score. if you've heard a net promoter score externally, where you're always asked the question, how likely are you to refer us, 1 through 10? If you have a high internal net promoter score, you got great human capital. So some things to consider when we're looking at human capital is, the satisfaction in the job. Is there opportunities to grow within the company? Is leadership well suited to motivate and cast a vision and all those components that leaders really need to be, or is it just a bunch of managers that are telling people what to do?
Mhm.
So it's really comes down to, if I was to summarize it, the happiness of the people within your company, which is different from the cultural and social component. And I think that the big difference here is the cultural side, and the social side is a lot around like mission, vision. How do we facilitate, what is our cultural components, our core values, all those things, and are we actually implementing them? And then I think human refers more to, uh, again, the happiness, the satisfaction. Do we have the right people here for our
Mhm.
culture?
Mhm. I mean, obviously, we understand that they're all very connected, right? Like you can
Mhm.
only be happy if you work within a certain structure that actually makes sense and it's not chaotic, right? With the right people, etc. But you know, oftentimes when we work with business owners, um, there's always this dynamic of like I actually identifying where are we at. We do an assessment, we do evaluation. Here's where your business is at,
Mhm.
and identify where they want to go and identify that gap. And on a again coming back on a P&L and profit numbers and sales numbers, that's fairly easy to do, right?
Yes.
But then on the human side, if we were looking at it through the lens of the human capital, um,
Mhm.
we have that question that you said as a that can be articulated as a score. Um,
Mhm.
what is actually that? What's the equivalent question from the net promoter score question to the what is it
Uh,
called?
the internal net promoter score.
Internal
Yeah.
net promoter score. What?
So that comes down to, you switch the phrasing of how likely would you be to recommend this company to a friend or colleague as a client, to how likely would you be to recommend this company to a friend to work here.
Work. Yeah.
So you just flip that around, as far as if you're looking externally to customers or internally to your employees. It's the same question. We just want to flip it in. uh, it gets us two, very distinct numbers, external and internal, but they mean very different things, and we can act upon those numbers differently too.
Yeah. So so I love that because again, there's probably 1,000 assessment questions you could ask
Right.
about your team, but then this one kind of like ties it down into one number that
Mhm.
is representative of just the overall aspect of human capital. But
Mhm.
sometimes, okay, so let's say you have a low score potentially, and you don't get
Mhm.
a lot of your employees right now wouldn't necessarily recommend or haven't brought in their friends or family to work with the company. What would be some access points to
Mhm.
say, okay, yeah, I know this number, but somehow I'm not where I want to be. Now we need to go a level more granular and look
Mhm.
at what other questions can I ask, or where else can I assess to be like more specifically targeting areas of improvement, I would think.
Being able to focus on improving your human capital within the
Yeah,
company.
yeah.
Um, I think similarly to external, doing a little market research and having those conversations with your employees. What would make working here more
More,
satisfactory? I think that could be a good place to start,
yeah,
depending on
yeah,
your
yeah,
questions or
yeah,
your
exactly.
answers, right?
Without
Yeah.
opening up a big can of worms there too.
Yeah. I want double the salary. No, but aside from that, just taking the temperature of your current people, uh, a lot of, if you have the right people in a small business, especially, you want people that are growth oriented, that are really looking to make a big impact. And if you don't have opportunities within your company for those types of people, they're going to become bored and stale and not really enjoy what they're doing. So being able to implement some sort of development within your company, whether it's structured or not, but being able to say, hey, we're going to have some sort of learning and development and continuous improvement of ourselves worked into our internal processes. And again, this comes back to satisfaction, and the satisfaction is different between who you're talking to. And I think that comes back to, do you have the right people
Yeah,
for your company
in
as
the right
well,
seats.
in the right seats? Yeah. And it, again, comes to the satisfaction point and who you want to work at your company, which it can happen trial by error. A lot of times of being able to find the right person, but being able to understand, what do you want your culture to look like, and what are the people that are really going to thrive within that culture, and then being able to tailor what your internal processes are for uh, your people's satisfaction, is going to be a huge difference. I mean, if you're an acquirer looking at a business, and you get to interview the staff, and they're like, yeah, it's okay, like not super happy, versus, a company is like, this is the best place I've ever worked.
Mhm.
That's going to make a huge difference in that intangible component to what an acquirer is actually going to pay for your business, because they don't want to. I mean, the risk of dissatisfied employees is flight risks. Yeah, they're out, and as soon as the transaction happens, they could leave, and that's a huge risk. So it's actually a really important piece to getting a good valuation.
Yeah, and I like how you're highlighting that from a risk perspective, a buyer's perspective, right? If you can, you're buying a company ultimately because you want to maintain what it's doing and then grow from
Mhm.
there. But
Yeah.
if you have a big dip in terms of talent leaving, or and then with that usually intelligence leaving and relationships
Hmm.
leaving, all of that, that's a high risk. And like you said, impacts the valuation of what a buyer is willing to buy.
Yeah.
I think for some reason this conversation around your employees being really happy in their environment is important, and happiness not as just like a superficial thing,
Mhm.
but business owners, we talk about like the different freedoms we have, freedom of
Yeah.
money, freedom of time, freedom of purpose, freedom of relationships. And I think that that applies to every human in a certain
Oh
way,
yeah.
and
Hmm.
it applies to employees. And I think, to your point, like, employees are really happy if they're in a place where they feel what they're doing is meaningful, is making a
Hmm.
contribution, they're working with great people, they can understand to what they're doing is directly impacting the the vision and mission of the company, and then therefore the impact to the community. And um, and that's important to understand how your team is perceiving where they're at. Like, perception is reality. And I think oftentimes an owner, you're intrinsically, or you're so connected to your mission, you're so connected to
Hmm.
your why you're doing things. So for you it might be very just normal to understand all of that, but for a lot of
Hmm.
employees, they have a whole different life, and that's just one aspect of it.
Right.
And how do you make sure they're really connected with it and have those conversations and understand how they're seeing things? It takes a lot of time, um, and patience and intentionality, I feel like, to really have
Hmm.
those conversations and understand. um, do you have like a maybe an example of someone, or like a business owner that you've worked with, that you feel like they're succeeding in this area? um I know it's
Yeah.
not easy, but
It's, well, yeah. I mean, I think one thing I'd like to add too is, I was having this conversation with with a client earlier this week of being able to facilitate an ownership mentality culture. You know, one one component of leadership that's really, I guess I'll say, popular as of late for good reason is servant leadership. And that's really being able to uh, lead from behind is kind of how I refer to it. Be a facilitator of people's growth, being able to allow them to be more autonomous, make their own decisions. And um, most people, most employees, that's what they want to. They want to do a good job, know that they're doing a good job, and have the freedom to be creative as well in their job, and being able to help facilitate that type of environment, which, as you mentioned, takes a lot of time and patience. Uh, I another client, we've been working through who are the right people, and a few people came to mind in this one business that I'm thinking of, that just weren't right fits, and we tried to make changes for them, try to make things a little bit easier or whatnot. But what it came down to is they just weren't the right fit to grow the company. They weren't happy. They didn't want to participate in any changes that we were making for growth of the company. They just wanted to stay where they were, and just clock in, clock out type situation, which wasn't going to help the company grow. And ultimately, this person wasn't happy in their position. The business wasn't happy with this person in the position. So, I mean, it was a mutual
Hmm.
understanding when it came down to it, but we did end up having to let the person go. In the business, the business has shown growth since then.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part, is if you don't have happy people within your company, you don't have good human capital. Even if it's one or two people, everyone will be happier if the decision is made.
Yeah. 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 Because sometimes, yeah, a dynamic is just in place because it's good enough to work, the job is getting done or whatnot, but you really
Yeah.
growing or have like that creative tension. Yeah, I think I'm glad we're tapping into this, and this might probably is a whole different conversation. Like really good leadership. Like how do you create that environment where you just have enough tension where people really feel like they're growing, but not to the extent where the expectation is just never met, and there's just like this big gap that they're
Mhm.
living in, or they're too bored and then they're just
Yeah.
checking out because um, you know I yeah, you always have people that don't care, but I believe
Mhm.
most employees, it's a matter of unlocking that
Yeah.
piece where they want to grow and work on themselves and work um, towards something bigger than just whatever their job description is, kind of even
Yeah.
within the context of that company. So um, all right, so closing thought, I think, for this conversation, we talked about, again, last time we talked about structural capital, human
Mhm.
capital. We talked about the internal net promoter score
Mhm.
as a number to measure where you're standing, and then we've talked about a couple more nuanced areas where someone can zoom in. Um, I guess, do you, maybe one last question, like would you recommend an owner to start out with like a questionnaire or like a survey, or would you say it's better to start out with personal conversations, individual conversations? Like if I haven't engaged in this conversation at all and I'm trying to get started, what would be a good first
Mhm.
step to dip into that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will mostly lean towards personal conversations,
Mhm.
to at least begin the conversation with your team, your employee. I mean, part of this is satisfaction, and if you are shoving surveys down people's throats all the time, that's going to lower satisfaction. So, but I mean, this can be passing conversation. It doesn't have to be a structure. It doesn't have to be on the calendar. It can be just a quick phone call, text message, passing in the hallway, whatever. Of, what do you like about working here? What are your goals? Where do you see yourself? Those types of things can help open up the conversation of what could you do as a business owner to maybe help facilitate a more satisfactory environment, help your employees, even on an individual basis. I talk about this with a handful of clients. Is when you bring people on, part of the onboarding process is what do you want to achieve, not only within this position, this role, but I mean, where do you see your life going, and really understanding the person as a person and helping them reach their goals, and not just say, here's a job, do the job, but
Yeah.
really can make that connection and work with them. I think is a really good first start to help understand who your people are and what you could implement within the company that will actually elevate the level of satisfaction and thus human capital.
Hmm. I think that's beautiful. Um, when you were talking, I just remembered one thing. Um, it's also, I think, right along with that, it is about you as an owner stepping back and
Hmm.
reflecting
Yeah.
why this is actually important to you. Because you don't just like those conversations, you can't just have mechanically. You can't approach it as a manager from a manager mindset. You have to really truly be connected to the person and show up,
Hmm.
because you're going to go into more personal, intimate conversations than just here's our KPIs, here's our metrics, here's our task list, whatever. And you have to be situated to be holding the space for those kind of conversations
Yeah.
and not just follow, go through the motions essentially. Because you can do a lot of harm if you're not intentional about it, opening that up and then having no follow through or not um,
Right. Hmm.
truly carrying this conversation forward, then people lose trust in you too,
Yeah.
in your leadership.
Hmm.
So anyway, I really enjoyed this conversation, Stephen. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great.
Uh, and to our listeners, again, take one or two things from this conversation. Start thinking
Mm.
about how you can apply it in your business. Ultimately, the road to a valuable business is you still take one step at a time, but we hope that through these conversations you have like different access points to actually see what can I focus on or should I focus on in my business as well.
Mhm.
So un,
Great.
until next week, I'd love to hear if you have any comments, any thoughts, any experiences from your own personal experience. Love to hear that. Put that in the comments, and then we'll see each other again next week.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.